On a crisp Seattle morning, a man in a dark hoodie settled into first class, and within minutes, the whispers began. The sky outside was a pale watercolor of late autumn, streaks of peach and silver breaking through the thinning clouds. Passengers drifted through the jet bridge with that peculiar mix of quiet urgency and early morning grogginess. Some clutched paper coffee cups from the Starbucks near Gate C11, the rich scent still clinging to their sleeves. Others juggled carry-ons and phones, checking boarding passes one last time before stepping into the narrow entryway of the aircraft. Caleb Warren had boarded with the rest of Group 1, his boarding pass scanned without so much as a beep of hesitation from the gate agent. He didn't glance toward the priority boarding lane, though he could have walked through it without a word. Instead, he kept his hood up, head slightly bowed, moving with the steady patience of a man in no rush to be noticed. Seat 2A waited for him, the left side window in the first row of the main first-class section. He slid into it with a quiet exhale, setting his small leather satchel under the seat in front of him. No laptop, no flashy briefcase, nothing that shouted business elite. Just a man in dark jeans, worn sneakers, and a hoodie the color of midnight. From his position, Caleb could see nearly the entire boarding process. He watched the flight attendants greet passengers, their voices bright but scripted, the way people talk when they've said the same words 300 times before. He noticed who got extra smiles, usually the well-dressed middle-aged men in suits, or the couples who seemed like they'd just come from a luxury weekend. It had been 2 months since the first complaint had landed on his desk, then another, then a third, all about this same route, Seattle to New York, Flight 278. The wording was different each time, but the theme was the same. Black and brown passengers in first class being made to feel like they didn't belong. Sometimes it was subtle, a delay in offering drinks, an extra check of their ticket. Sometimes it was overt. Caleb had decided to see for himself. No press, no name attached to the reservation. He booked the ticket through his personal account, paying the same price as any other traveler. He'd told only one person about the plan, Monica Reed, his assistant. She had instructions to be ready. The cabin was quiet except for the shuffle of boarding and the faint hum of the ventilation system. Caleb's gaze was calm, but he took in everything, the tone of voices, the way attendants leaned toward some passengers but kept distance from others, the glances that lasted half a second too long. He was invisible, just another passenger. Until she appeared. Samantha Holt, lead flight attendant, moved up the aisle with the confidence of someone who knew she ran this cabin. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, a hint of perfume trailing behind her. She greeted the couple in 1C and 1D with a warm smile, then turned to step into the galley. That's when she noticed him. Her eyes paused, not in recognition, but in calculation. A quick flick from the hood to the jeans to the sneakers. The smile she'd worn for the couple vanished. Samantha didn't stop right away. She passed by, then disappeared into the forward galley. Through the corner of his eye, Caleb saw her glance at the passenger manifest on the counter. Her brow furrowed, lips moving slightly as she read. A moment later, she emerged and walked straight toward him. "Good morning, sir," she said, her tone polite but lacking warmth. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Caleb reached into his pocket without a word and handed it over. She studied it for a moment, her eyes flicking from the small print to his face as if the two didn't match. "This is for first class," she said finally. "Yes," Caleb replied, his voice even, offering nothing more. There was a pause, not long enough to be called awkward, but long enough for him to see the questions forming in her mind. She handed the pass back without comment and walked away again. Caleb settled back in his seat. He didn't look around to see if anyone had noticed. He didn't need to. Years of experience had taught him that the smallest exchanges could carry the heaviest weight. Behind him, the shuffle of passengers continued. Somewhere in row 4, a man coughed. From the far end of the cabin, the metallic click of an overhead bin closing echoed faintly. Samantha's voice came from the galley, quieter now, but still audible to anyone close by. Caleb couldn't catch every word, but he heard security and verify. He kept his eyes on the window, watching a fuel truck trundle past on the tarmac. Minutes later, a tall man in a navy blazer and security badge clipped to his belt stepped into the cabin. Derek Vaughn didn't smile. He walked straight to seat 2A, planting himself in the narrow space between Caleb's row and the bulkhead. "Sir," Derek said, his voice firm, "I need to confirm your identity and verify how you obtained this ticket." Caleb blinked once, slowly. "Why?" he asked. "Protocol," Derek replied. "We've had people attempt to access premium cabins without authorization." Caleb's tone stayed level. "So protocol now includes questioning paying passengers based on wardrobe?" A flicker passed over Derek's expression. Not guilt, but a tightening of control. "Let's just make this easy," he said. From across the aisle, a man with tousled hair and a canvas jacket, Ethan Cole, shifted in his seat, phone in hand. He angled the camera just slightly, the lens catching Caleb, Derek, and the edge of Samantha's posture in the galley. In the row ahead, Maggie Turner adjusted her pearl earrings and leaned just enough to look back at the scene. She'd been flying for decades, and something about this didn't sit right. Caleb's gaze never wavered. He kept his voice calm, his body language open but unyielding. Years in boardrooms and cockpits had taught him the power of composure. The first move was never to shout. The first move was to watch. Samantha stepped closer now, standing just behind Derek. "Mr. Warren, how exactly did you get this seat?" Her voice was firm, her eyes colder than the morning air. The question hung in the air, heavy enough to turn a few heads in first class. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The hum of the ventilation filled the silence, underscored by the muted shuffle of passengers settling into their seats. Caleb didn't look away from Samantha Holt. He had learned long ago that stillness could be as commanding as any raised voice. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her, the crisp sleeves of her uniform jacket brushing against her wrists. Derek Vaughn loomed beside her, arms folded, his stance blocking the narrow space between the aisle and Caleb's seat. Caleb took a measured breath. "The same way anyone does," he said evenly. "I bought it." A flicker of something, doubt, disbelief, passed over Samantha's face. "When did you book this flight?" she asked, the words careful but edged. 2 weeks ago, Caleb replied, through the airline's website. From the row across the aisle, Ethan Cole tilted his phone slightly, ensuring both Caleb and Samantha were in frame. He had filmed tense moments before, street protests, council meetings, but this was different. Here, the tension was wrapped in polite voices and sharp glances, the kind that carried a deeper cut. Samantha's smile was thin. "Do you have ID with you?" Caleb reached into his satchel, withdrew his wallet, and handed over a driver's license. She took it, glanced at it briefly, then passed it to Derek. Derek studied the card, his eyes darting between the photo and Caleb's face. "You live in Bellevue?" he asked. "Yes." "Business in New York?" "Something like that," Caleb said. The exchange was brief, but the weight of it pressed into the surrounding passengers. In seat 3B, a middle-aged man shifted uncomfortably, pulling his laptop from its case but not opening it. 2 rows back, a young woman frowned, her gaze flicking between the crew and Caleb. Maggie Turner, still leaning slightly into the aisle, cleared her throat. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying a note of authority born from years of speaking in classrooms. "I saw this gentleman board the plane. He scanned his ticket like everyone else. He belongs here." Samantha didn't respond. She handed Caleb's ID back to Derek, who returned it to him with a tight nod. But the moment wasn't over. Samantha's tone shifted. Her words clipped. "Mr. Warren, you can't just sit here because you feel entitled." The word landed like a pebble in still water, rippling outward. Caleb didn't flinch, but he felt the familiar sting, one he had known since his teenage years, working under men who assumed his place was always somewhere else. Ethan's thumb hovered over his phone screen, then pressed. The soft click of the record button was almost lost under the ambient cabin noise. Almost. In the rear of first class, a murmur began, quiet at first, then building. Someone whispered, "What's going on?" Another voice, lower, asked, "Would they be doing this if he were white?" Derek shifted, glancing toward the source of the whispers, then back to Caleb. "Sir, we just need to be sure," he said. "You've checked my ticket and my ID," Caleb replied. "What else do you need?" There was no answer. Samantha stood still, her jaw tightening. Caleb leaned back, his hands resting loosely on his knees. He could feel the eyes on him, some sympathetic, some curious, some guarded. He'd been in this position before, though never in a seat he technically owned part of. Outside the window, the tarmac glistened faintly under the thin autumn sun. Ground crew moved between carts and luggage holds, their high-visibility vests catching the light. Inside, the air felt heavier than the sealed cabin should allow. Samantha glanced toward the galley, then back at Derek. Her meaning was clear. Don't let this drop. Caleb's gaze didn't waver. His voice was calm, but there was a steel edge beneath it. You've made your point. The question is, do you realize what it says about you? Maggie's eyes brightened, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She recognized the tone, quiet, deliberate, meant to make the other person hear themselves. Ethan's phone caught the entire exchange, his other hand shielding the screen from glare. He knew this was more than a customer service mishap. This was a moment people would understand, because they'd felt it too. Samantha didn't answer. Instead, she stepped back half a pace, her eyes narrowing slightly. Derek remained in place, a wall between Caleb and the rest of the cabin. Caleb leaned back further, silent. But his hand slowly reached for his phone. The soft click of a record button turned a quiet slight into a public moment. Ethan Cole's phone lens caught Caleb Warren in crisp focus, framed by the muted elegance of Pacific Horizon's first-class cabin. Caleb sat back, shoulders relaxed, face calm. Across from him, Samantha Holt stood rigid, and Derek Vaughn blocked the aisle like a sentry. Ethan had been a journalist long enough to know that sometimes the smallest incidents told the biggest stories. This wasn't shouting or physical confrontation. It was the sharp chill of someone being told, in so many words, "You don't belong here." And it was happening in a place where belonging was supposedly guaranteed by a boarding pass. Passengers shifted in their seats, sensing the weight of what was unfolding. A woman in 4C leaned toward her husband, whispering behind her hand. A college-aged man in 5A pretended to scroll his phone, but the angle of his gaze betrayed him. Even the hum of the aircraft's ventilation seemed to dim under the tension. Samantha adjusted her stance, glancing toward the galley. Her voice, when it came, was loud enough for the first few rows to hear. "Security will remove you if you don't comply." Caleb's reply was smooth, unhurried. "I am complying. I'm in my assigned seat, and I haven't raised my voice. Is there a specific rule I've broken?" Derek's jaw tightened. This isn't about rules. It's about cooperation. Caleb tilted his head slightly. "You mean compliance?" The word hung there, and for a brief second, Derek seemed at a loss. Ethan's camera followed every nuance. The small lift of Caleb's eyebrow, the subtle way Samantha's shoulders squared, the faint crease forming between Derek's eyes. This was the sort of visual language audiences understood without narration. From 2 rows up, Maggie Turner decided she'd seen enough. Her voice, clear and unwavering, cut through the tension. "He belongs here," she said, turning toward Samantha. "I saw him board with the rest of us, ticket scanned, seat assigned. This is wrong, and you know it." The cabin went still. Maggie's words had the tone of someone used to telling the truth plainly, without sugarcoating. Caleb didn't turn to look at her, but a flicker of gratitude passed through his expression. Samantha didn't answer Maggie directly. Instead, she glanced at Derek, her lips pressed thin. "We're not going to debate this in the aisle," she said. But the debate was already happening, not out loud, but in the quiet court of passenger opinion. A man in 3B muttered under his breath, "Wouldn't be happening if he was white." The young woman in 4D nodded faintly in agreement. Ethan felt the subtle vibration of his phone. The video was uploading. He'd kept the caption simple. See, JFK, Flight 278. Still happening in 2025. Caleb remained still, the picture of composure. He knew the value of letting others speak first, of allowing the scene to show its own imbalance. Years of boardroom negotiations had taught him that silence could be a mirror, forcing others to see themselves more clearly. In the back of the cabin, a flight attendant leaned toward another, whispering, "What's going on up there?" The reply was a small shake of the head. The tension thickened as the moments passed. No one moved to serve drinks. The usual polite chatter between crew and passengers had evaporated. The only sounds were the occasional cough, the muted zippers of carry-ons, and the quiet chime of another phone unlocking somewhere in the cabin. Caleb's phone lit up on the tray table. A single name appeared. Monica Reed. He didn't tap it right away. He simply looked at the screen for a moment, then glanced back up at Derek and Samantha. "Are we done here?" Caleb asked, his tone still low, but now edged with finality. Neither answered. Derek stepped back half an inch, enough to no longer be looming, but not enough to clear the aisle. Samantha's lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. Caleb reached for his phone. His thumb hovered, then pressed the green icon. "Monica," he said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for Ethan's camera to catch. "You can come now." The cabin door hissed open, and in walked a woman whose presence shifted the air. She was in her mid-30s, tall enough to stand out without heels, but she wore them anyway, polished black pumps that clicked softly against the aisle carpet. A tailored gray blazer framed her posture, and in her left hand she carried a slim leather-bound folder. Her expression was calm, but there was no mistaking the intent in her stride. Caleb Warren didn't turn toward her immediately. He kept his gaze on the tarmac outside, as if he'd been expecting her all along. Monica Reed didn't pause to greet the crew. She didn't need to. People moved for her without thinking, stepping back just enough to let her pass. Samantha Holt's eyes flicked up from the galley, narrowing in confusion. Derek Vaughn, still posted near 2A, straightened as though bracing for impact. She stopped beside Caleb's seat. "Mr. Warren," she said, voice low but perfectly clear. "You called?" Caleb looked up then, meeting her eyes with a slight nod. "Yes." That single word was enough to make the passengers in rows 1 through 4 lean forward, as if they just felt the shift of an unseen current. Monica turned, her gaze sweeping across Samantha, Derek, and finally toward the cockpit door. "Captain Avery?" she called, not raising her voice but projecting it with practiced authority. The cockpit door opened a few inches. Captain Thomas Avery stepped into the aisle, his uniform crisp, his expression somewhere between curiosity and caution. "Captain," Monica began, "you should know that your crew has publicly profiled the CEO and principal shareholder of this airline. On camera, with multiple witnesses present." It was the kind of statement that sucked the oxygen out of a room. Several passengers glanced at one another. A few sat back in shock. Ethan Cole's camera phone tilted to capture both Monica and Caleb in the same frame. Samantha's mouth opened, but Monica's eyes cut to her with such precision that the words died before they began. "Ms. Holt," Monica continued, "you've just accused, questioned, and attempted to remove a paying passenger because his appearance didn't fit your assumption of who belongs here. That passenger also happens to be your ultimate employer." The color drained from Samantha's face. Derek's jaw flexed, his weight shifting from one foot to the other. Caleb rose from his seat, not with force, but with the deliberate calm of someone who knows every eye is on him. He stood beside Monica, his hands loose at his sides. "You shouldn't need to know someone's title to treat them with dignity," he said. The statement landed like a gavel strike. Maggie Turner murmured a soft, approving, "That's right," which a few passengers echoed under their breath. Captain Avery stepped forward, attempting to regain control. "Mr. Warren, I assure you, had we known—" Caleb raised a hand, palm out. "Stop right there. That sentence proves my point." Silence settled heavy over the cabin. Samantha looked as if she wanted to speak again, but Monica shifted the folder in her hands, drawing attention to it. "This," Monica said, "is a formal incident report. It details the behavior of the lead flight attendant, the security officer, and the captain in this matter. It will be filed with both the Ethics Board and the Executive Committee before this aircraft reaches cruising altitude." Ethan's phone buzzed. A notification from his post. The video he'd uploaded barely 10 minutes earlier had passed 500,000 views. Passengers who had been content to watch passively now sat upright, their expressions changed. Some looked at Caleb with new recognition. Others turned toward the crew, their eyes sharper than before. Samantha swallowed hard. "Mr. Warren, It wasn't personal." Caleb's eyes met hers. "Everything is personal to the person it happens to." He turned back to the cabin, addressing everyone now. "You all watched this. It started with doubt, moved to escalation, and ended here, because I wore a hoodie instead of a suit. If I didn't have this name, this title, I would already be walking off this plane, humiliated, and most of you would never know why." Maggie's voice rose again, clear and unwavering. "I've been flying 40 years. I've never seen a man handle disrespect with this much grace." Monica opened the leather folder, sliding a single sheet forward. Her eyes met Caleb's. "We'll be making changes right now." Silence fell as Caleb rose from his seat, steady and unshakable. For a moment, no one seemed to breathe. The aisle was narrow, yet it felt like the space had widened just enough for him to command it. Caleb stepped forward until he stood between his row and the galley, every movement deliberate. His eyes went first to Captain Thomas Avery. "Captain," he began, voice calm but carrying through the cabin, "your first duty is to ensure the safety and dignity of every passenger on board. Today, that duty failed." Avery's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Caleb turned to Samantha Holt. "You saw a hoodie and decided it didn't belong here. You saw my skin and filled in the rest with your assumptions. That is not service. That is bias." Samantha's eyes glistened. "Mr. Warren, He held up a hand. "This isn't a conversation. It's an action." Then to Derek Vaughn. "Security is meant to protect, not intimidate. Protocol does not authorize humiliation, yet you chose that path." Derek shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the cockpit as though seeking a signal. None came. Caleb drew a steady breath. "Effective immediately, Captain Avery, Ms. Holt, and Mr. Vaughn, you are relieved of duty." A ripple of surprise moved through the passengers. Some gasped softly. Others leaned forward, eyes wide. Maggie Turner's lips pressed into a satisfied line. Monica Reed stepped forward, opening the leather folder. She withdrew 3 sealed envelopes and handed them one by one. "Per executive oversight and shareholder authority," she said, her voice crisp, "Mr. Warren has the right to suspend crew mid-operation when safety, ethics, or civil conduct have been breached." Samantha stared at the envelope in her hand, her knuckles pale. Avery glanced down at his, then back up at Caleb. Derek's grip on his was tight enough to crease the paper. From the rear galley, a figure stepped forward. Jordan Banks, dressed in a pristine Navy uniform, posture straight and confident. His eyes met Caleb's, and he gave a respectful nod. "Mr. Warren, I'm ready to serve." Caleb's voice softened slightly. "Just be what they weren't. See people." Jordan nodded again, understanding the weight of the words. Behind him came 2 more crew members, ready to replace those being dismissed. The transition was quiet but decisive. Monica gestured toward the jet bridge, and within minutes, the outgoing crew had gathered their belongings. There was no shouting, no spectacle, only the muted sound of footsteps down the aisle, the soft click of the cabin door opening, and the final hiss as it closed behind them. The air seemed to shift. Conversations began in hushed tones, a few passengers leaning toward one another to process what they'd just seen. Caleb returned to seat 2A. He sat with the same composure he'd maintained since boarding, hands resting lightly on his knees. Jordan approached and offered a polite, "Can I get you something, sir?" "Respect," Caleb said quietly. "That's all anyone ever needed." Jordan gave a small smile and moved on to prepare the cabin for departure. Maggie leaned over the aisle, her voice low but clear. "You changed something today." Caleb gave her a small nod. "That's the point." From across the aisle, Ethan Cole checked his phone. The video had surpassed 2 million views and was climbing. Notifications pinged rapidly, national outlets asking for permission to use the footage. But Caleb wasn't watching the numbers. His focus was on the steady hum of the aircraft, the shuffle of passengers settling back in, the quiet return of order, a different kind of order than before. The jet bridge door closed behind the former crew, and the cabin seemed to exhale. As the plane taxied away, Caleb opened a fresh page in his notebook. The hum of the engines was steady, almost soothing, as Pacific Horizon Flight 278 rolled toward the runway. Outside his window, the low autumn sun lit the tarmac in gold. Inside, the mood in first class had shifted, not to celebration, but to something quieter. Reflection. He wrote 3 words at the top of the page. Legacy starts now. Monica Reed was seated across the aisle, her blazer still perfectly in place, though her eyes were softer now. She glanced at the page but didn't speak. There was nothing to say. They both knew what those words meant. Jordan Banks moved through the cabin with an ease that felt genuine. He greeted passengers without scripted smiles, asked questions that sounded real, and leaned in just enough to show he was listening. Caleb watched him offer a blanket to the young woman in 4D and help an older gentleman stow his bag without making him feel like a burden. Ethan Cole was still in his seat, phone in hand, the faint glow of the screen reflecting in his eyes. He checked the numbers again. The video had now crossed 5 million views. News outlets were tagging his post, hashtags multiplying by the minute. In 3A, Maggie Turner had settled back with a paperback novel, but every so often she looked toward Caleb with the faintest smile, as if reassured simply by his presence. Caleb leaned back, pen resting against the page. He began outlining what he'd been thinking about since before this flight even boarded, a complete overhaul of the airline's approach to dignity and diversity. It would be called the Skyline Protocol, training that wasn't just a box to check, but an immersive program in awareness, empathy, and equitable service. Every complaint involving discrimination would be reviewed by an independent ethics council, with quarterly reports made public. The goal wasn't punishment, it was transformation. As he wrote, the cabin intercom chimed. Monica rose and stepped toward the cockpit. Moments later, Captain Avery's replacement, First Officer Amelia Kerr, spoke. "Good morning, passengers. This is your new captain. Thank you for your patience. We'll be in the air shortly, bound for New York. On behalf of the crew, I want to thank you for your understanding and your courage." That last word lingered. Courage. Caleb let it sink in. When the plane lifted from the runway, the angle of ascent pressed him gently into his seat. He closed his eyes for a moment, remembering other takeoffs, some in commercial cabins, some from military runways, some in small propeller planes he could barely afford to fuel. Each one had carried him away from something and toward something else. Now he wasn't leaving anything behind. He was carrying it with him. The faces of every person who'd ever been told they didn't belong, and the quiet promise to make sure they would. Jordan returned to his row. "Mr. Warren, can I offer you something now?" Caleb smiled faintly. "Yes, something cold, something quiet, and something earned." Jordan nodded, heading toward the galley. Across the aisle, Maggie closed her book and leaned toward him. "I hope you know," she said. "This isn't just about today. People will remember this." "That's the idea," Caleb replied softly. He turned back to his notebook, adding a line under his earlier words. "Dignity first, always." Outside, the clouds parted just enough for the skyline of New York to appear far ahead, a thin silhouette against the horizon. We're all human. That's the only title that matters. As Flight 278 descended toward New York, the hum of the engines felt almost like a heartbeat, steady, reassuring, alive. In the quiet of that cabin, it was impossible to ignore what had happened, not because of the drama, but because of the dignity with which it was handled. Caleb Warren never raised his voice. He never leaned on his title until the moment it mattered. Instead, he held up a mirror, showing everyone on board, crew and passengers alike, what bias looks like when it hides behind uniforms and polite words. And when the truth came out, he didn't just correct the wrong. He began building something better. For those in the Black community, this moment resonated far beyond the aisle of an airplane. It echoed the times when simply existing in a space meant having to justify your right to be there. Caleb's quiet defiance was not just for himself, but for every person who'd been told in subtle or blunt ways, "You don't belong." The lesson here is simple but heavy. Dignity should never be conditional. Respect should never depend on a name tag, a paycheck, or the clothes on your back. The Black community has long understood the weight of those conditions, and the relief, even joy, that comes when someone in power refuses to play by them. Caleb's Skyline protocol wasn't about revenge. It was about rewriting the rules so that no passenger from any background would have to carry the same burden he faced that morning. For the airline, it was a cultural reset. For passengers, it was a promise. For the Black community, it was a visible, public affirmation that change can happen in the spaces where it's most needed, even 30,000 feet in the air. And maybe that's what stays with us. Not the headlines or the viral video, but the image of a man sitting in a simple hoodie, calm and unshaken, refusing to be moved. Not out of stubbornness, but out of principle. Like a lighthouse standing in a storm, his presence lit the way without pushing anyone off the path. It reminded us that leadership isn't about how loudly you can speak, but how deeply your actions can be felt. So as you go about your day, think about the seats you take in life, whether in a boardroom, a classroom, a church pew, or a plane. Think about who's watching and what lesson they might learn from how you carry yourself. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need the reminder. Because change doesn't just happen in headlines. It happens in the quiet, in the choices we make, and in the respect we give freely. And if you ever find yourself in a seat where someone doubts your right to be there, remember Caleb Warren. Remember the stillness, the grace, and the simple truth. We're all human. That's the only title that matters.